what rejection is actually teaching you. Every piece of advice you have ever heard about rejection is technically true and completely wrong. You have been told that. Rejection is not personal, and this is technically true and almost entirely useless, because rejection lands in the body as personal, regardless of what the rational mind knows about it. And telling a man not to take something personally that he has already taken personally is not wisdom. It is dismissal dressed in the language of perspective. You have been told that rejection builds resilience, and this is technically true in the same way that fire technically produces warmth, without acknowledging that the same fire, mishandled, burns the house down. You have been told that every rejection brings you closer to a yes, which is the kind of thing that sounds encouraging in a motivational context and means almost nothing when you are sitting with the actual experience of having reached towards something you wanted and been told, in whatever form the telling took, that the answer is no. The advice is not wrong. It is incomplete, and the incompleteness is where most men get stuck, cycling through the same patterns of avoidance or overcompensation, never quite extracting what the rejection was actually trying to give them. What rejection is actually trying to give you is information, but not the information most men go looking for in its aftermath. When the rejection arrives, and the internal processing begins, the questions men typically ask are variations of a single theme. What is wrong with me? Sometimes this question is conscious and explicit. More often it is the silent organizer of the entire post-rejection experience, the invisible frame through which everything gets interpreted. The analysis of what you said, how you looked, what you should have done differently, is almost always an analysis conducted through the lens of self-indictment, a forensic examination of your own inadequacy in search of the specific defect that caused the outcome. This is understandable. It is also almost entirely counterproductive, because it is asking the wrong question of the wrong event, and a wrong question, however rigorously pursued, will never produce a useful answer. The right question is not what is wrong with you. The right question is what is true about you, about what you were pursuing, about the gap between where you currently are and what you are reaching for, and about what specifically needs to change for that gap to close. These are not the same question. The first question is a verdict in search of evidence. The second is a diagnosis in search of a solution. The first leaves you smaller than you were before the rejection. The second, engaged with honestly and without the distortion of shame, leaves you more capable. The difference between men who are genuinely transformed by their rejections and men who are merely accumulated by them is almost always this. One is asking what is true and the other is asking what is wrong. And the distinction, while it sounds subtle, produces entirely different lives over a sufficient span of time. What this chapter will give you is a complete reorientation to the experience of rejection, not as a wound to be managed or a data point to be rationalized, but as one of the most precise and honest feedback mechanisms available to a man who is genuinely trying to grow. You will understand what rejection is actually measuring, while your current response to it is almost certainly costing you more than the rejection itself, and how to develop the specific relationship with it that turns one of the most uncomfortable experiences in a man's life into one of his most reliable tools. Rejection is a measurement. This is the core concept, and it needs to be held with precision rather than with the vague optimism that usually accompanies attempts to reframe painful experiences. It is not a measurement of your worth as a human being, which is the reassurance most men receive and find temporarily comforting and ultimately insufficient. It is a measurement of fit, readiness, and presentation at a specific moment in time, and like all measurements, its value is entirely dependent on whether you read it accurately or whether you allow the emotional charge of the moment to distort the instrument. A thermometer does not tell you that you are a bad person because you have a fever. It tells you your temperature. Rejection does not tell you that you are fundamentally undesirable or unqualified or unworthy. It tells you, with a specificity that is available if you are willing to look for it, that something about the interaction between who you currently are and what you are reaching for did not produce the outcome you wanted. That gap between who you are and what you were reaching for is not a condemnation. It is a curriculum. Consider a man in his late 20s who has been passed over for a promotion he has wanted for 2 years. He is competent. His technical work is strong. He has told himself and believed e.t., that he is ready, and the rejection of his readiness by the people with the authority to confirm or deny it lands as a blow to something deeper than his career ambitions. It lands as a blow to his self-conception, to the story he has been telling himself about who he is and where he is headed, and the response that follows is the one most men default to in this situation, a mixture of private grievance, public stoicism, and a general hardening against the environment that produced the outcome. He becomes less visible, not more. He pulls back from the initiative that would have demonstrated his readiness, because the initiative now feels like exposure, and exposure feels dangerous. He waits, in the way that men who have been hurt by reaching tend to wait, for conditions to become safer before reaching again. And the next promotion cycle arrives, and he is passed over again, and this time the blow is heavier, because it carries the weight of the previous one, and the pattern deepens, and the interpretation that something is fundamentally wrong with him becomes more entrenched, and the actual information the rejection contained, the specific, actionable, correctable information about what readiness actually looks like for the role he wants, remains unexamined because he was too busy processing the verdict to read the evidence. The misconception that makes this pattern nearly universal among men is the belief that rejection is primarily an emotional event and therefore requires primarily an emotional response. This belief is reinforced by every cultural message about how men should process difficulty, which oscillates between the instruction to feel it fully and the instruction to push through it, with very little guidance about the analytical work that sits between those two poles and produces the only thing that makes the pain of rejection genuinely worthwhile: understanding. The emotional response to rejection is real, and it deserves acknowledgement, not suppression. A man who pretends that rejection does not affect him is not strong. He is defended, which is a different thing entirely, and the defense cost him the very sensitivity that would allow him to read the rejection accurately. You have to let it land. You have to feel the specific quality of the disappointment, the place in your chest where it sits, the particular flavor of this rejection as distinct from others you have experienced. That feeling is not weakness. It is data. It is the emotional registration of the gap between expectation and reality, and that gap, felt fully and then examined clearly, is where the learning lives. The reframe that changes everything is learning to ask, in the aftermath of a rejection, not why it happened in the way that seeks a verdict, but what it revealed in the way that seeks a map. These are different inquiries that produce different results. The verdict-seeking question organizes itself around your adequacy. Was I enough? Did I do enough? Am I fundamentally the kind of person who gets this thing or not? The map-seeking question organizes itself around the gap. What specifically was the distance between where I was and what was required? What would closing that distance actually look like? And what would I need to develop, demonstrate, or do differently to change the outcome next time? The map-seeking question requires more courage than the verdict-seeking question, because it requires you to engage with the rejection as a real assessment of a real gap rather than as an arbitrary cruelty or a systemic injustice or a reflection of the other person's limitations. Sometimes those things are true. Sometimes the rejection genuinely says more about the person or institution delivering it than about you. But that is less often true than wounded pride would like it to be, and the habit of defaulting to that explanation, while it protects you from the discomfort of honest self-examination, also protects you from the growth that honest self-examination produces. The romantic rejection deserves its own examination because it carries a particular charge that professional or social rejection does not. A charge rooted in the fact that romantic desire is one of the most vulnerable expressions of the self available to a human being. When you tell someone, through words or action or sustained pursuit, that you want them, you are offering something that has no professional equivalent, and the refusal of that offering lands in a place that professional rejection cannot reach. This is why men develop such elaborate defensive architectures around romantic risk, the avoidance of pursuit, the ambiguity maintained long past the point where clarity would serve everyone better, the ironic detachment deployed as a shield against the possibility of being seen, wanting something and not getting it. All of these defenses share a common cost. They prevent the rejection that would hurt, and they also prevent the connection that would matter. because genuine connection requires the same vulnerability that genuine rejection punishes. The man who has decided that the pain of romantic rejection is a cost he is no longer willing to pay has also decided, without quite framing it this way, that the depth of romantic connection is a reward he is no longer willing to pursue. The armor that keeps the wound out also keeps everything else out. You cannot selectively seal yourself against pain and remain open to everything else. The same porousness that allows rejection to hurt is the porousness that allows intimacy to form. The reflection this requires is not a single question, but a practice of inquiry that you apply to every significant rejection you experience going forward, and ideally to the significant. Rejections already in your history that you have interpreted as verdicts and never revisited as information. Take the rejection that stings most when you bring it to mind, the one that has done the most to shape how you approach similar situations, now, and ask it the map-seeking questions rather than the verdict-seeking ones. What specifically was the gap between what I was offering and what was being looked for? What would I need to have been known, demonstrated, or done differently for the outcome to have changed? What did this rejection reveal about my readiness, my presentation, my self-awareness, or my understanding of what I was actually pursuing? And then ask the question that most men never reach. What did I do with this rejection when it arrived? And has that response served me? Or has it deepened the very gap I needed to? Close. The answers will be uncomfortable. They will also be among the most useful things you have ever given yourself, because they convert the accumulated weight of your most painful experiences from a burden into a foundation. The men who grow from rejection and the men who are merely marked by it are not distinguished by how much rejection they have experienced. They are distinguished by what they do in the hours and days after the rejection settles, after the initial sting has dulled enough for honest thinking to become possible. Again, one man uses that window to extract the information and adjust his trajectory. The other man uses it to rebuild the defensive architecture that will protect him from the next attempt. And the protection is so effective that the next attempt barely happens, or happens so hedged and armoured and preemptively distanced that it cannot possibly produce the outcome he actually wants, which means it produces another rejection, which reinforces the architecture, which makes the next attempt even more defended, and the spiral tightens over, years into a life lived at a careful, managed distance from everything he actually wants most. You know which spiral you have been in. You do not need to be told what you need, and what most men in that spiral never receive because the people around them are too careful or too polite or too unaware to offer it, is the honest reflection that the spiral is a choice, not a destiny, not conscious choice made in a single moment with full awareness of its implications, but a choice nonetheless, assembled from the hundreds of small decisions about whether to reach or to protect, whether to risk or to manage, whether to let the rejection teach you or to let it define you. Those decisions accumulate, the way all decisions accumulate, into a character and then into a life, and the life you end up with is the sum of which direction you chose most, often when the choice was available. Most men, looking back, did not choose protection because they examined the options and found it superior. They chose it because it was immediate, and the alternative was painful, and the compound cost of that choice did not reveal itself until the years had passed and the distance between where they are and where they wanted to be had grown into something that felt, from the inside, like fate. It is not fate. It is feedback that was never read. It is a curriculum that was never completed. It is a series of precise, honest, occasionally brutal measurements of the gap between who you were in those moments and what you were reaching for, measurements that contained within them, if you had been willing to look, the exact specifications of the man you needed to become to close that gap. The rejection was not the obstacle. The rejection was the instruction manual for getting past the obstacle, and you put it down unread because the cover was too painful to open. There is a particular kind of man who has been through significant rejection and come out the other side not hardened, but clarified. He's not the man who learned not to care, because not caring is not a destination. It is an anesthetic, and anesthetics wear off and leave you in the same pain you were trying to avoid, with the additional problem of having lost time. While you were numb, he is the man who learned to care differently, to bring the full weight of his desire and effort and genuine self to the things he pursues. while holding the outcome with a looseness that comes not from indifference, but from the hard-won understanding that the outcome was never entirely his to determine. He reached. He was rejected. He read the rejection clearly, made the adjustment it indicated, and reached again from a slightly different and more capable position. He did this enough times that the reaching became natural and the rejection became not painless, but proportionate, a real signal from a real world that he is equipped to read and respond to rather than a verdict from an authority whose judgment determines his worth. That clarification is available to you, not as a personality type you either have or do not have, not as the exclusive property of men who are naturally resilient or who are shaped by circumstances that made them better at handling difficulty. It is available as a practice, beginning with the next rejection you experience, which may be sooner than you would like, when it arrives, and it will arrive, because a man who is genuinely reaching for things that matter to him will be rejected regularly, and that regularity is a sign of engagement rather than failure. You will have a choice in the window after the sting. You can close, protect, interpret, and armor, or you can open, examine, extract, and adjust. The first choice is faster and it feels, in the immediate term, like self-preservation. The second choice is harder and it produces, over the medium and long term, the only thing that actually preserves anything worth preserving. A man who is genuinely, continuously becoming more capable of the life he is trying to build. Rejection is not the proof that you are not enough. It is the precise description of the distance between who you are right now and who you need to become, and the distance, however uncomfortable it is to measure, is always crossable by a man who is willing to read the map honestly and keep moving. The question rejection has always been asking you is not whether you are worthy. It is whether you are paying attention.